The stars burned cold that night. Captain Cal Valen stood on the bridge of his flagship, the ebon dawn, staring out at the endless void. His crew moved around him like clockwork, their voices low and steady as they prepared for what should have been a routine supply run. But something felt wrong. Deep in his gut, Cal sensed it, a faint unease, like the first whisper of a storm before the skies broke open. "Captain," called Lieutenant Mara, her voice cutting through the hum of the ship's engines. "We're picking up unusual readings ahead. Looks like debris." Cal frowned. Debris wasn't uncommon in this sector, but the timing was suspicious. He tapped a command into the console beside him, bringing up a holographic display of the area. Sure enough, chunks of metal floated aimlessly in the darkness, remnants of ships torn apart by weapons far more powerful than anything they carried. "Scan for life signs," he ordered, his tone sharp. Mara hesitated. "Already did, sir." "Nothing." Cal's frown deepened. Something about this didn't add up. For years, he had led missions across the galaxy, earning a reputation as one of the Accord's most trusted captains. But trust was a fragile thing, especially in a universe where power shifted faster than starlight. Before he could give another order, alarms blared throughout the ship. Red lights flashed, bathing the bridge in an ominous glow. "Incoming," shouted Ensign Rin from the sensor station. "Multiple hostiles decloaking. Chancellor Soren's fleet." Cal's blood ran cold. Chancellor Soren. What was the Accord's leader doing here? And why were his ships armed to the teeth? "Raise shields." Cal barked, already moving toward the tactical console. "Hail them." But there was no response. Instead, beams of searing energy lanced through space, striking the ebon dawn with devastating force. The ship shuddered violently, throwing several crew members off their feet. Sparks rained down from overloaded panels, and smoke filled the air. "Shields at 60%. Mara yelled over the chaos. Cal clenched his fists, fury rising in his chest. This wasn't just an attack, it was betrayal. Someone had sold them out. "Return fire," he commanded. "Target their lead cruiser." For a moment, it seemed like they might stand a chance. The rebels aboard the ebon dawn fought back with everything they had, their smaller vessel weaving between the larger warships like a blade slicing through armor. But it wasn't enough. Outnumbered and outgunned, their defenses crumbled under relentless assault. Then came the final blow. A massive blast that tore through the hull, sending flames roaring through the corridors. Cal stumbled as the floor tilted beneath him, his ears ringing from the deafening explosion. Around him, his crew screamed, cried, or fell silent forever. Through the haze of smoke and fire, Cal saw Mara collapse, clutching her side. Her eyes met his, wide with pain and fear. "Captain," she whispered before darkness claimed her. And then silence. When Cal awoke, he was alone. Drifting in the wreckage of his once proud ship, he stared at the charred remains of his crewmates. His homeworld, visible in the distance, was now a smoldering ruin, its surface scarred by orbital bombardment. They took everything from him, his family, his friends, his purpose, all gone in an instant. As tears mixed with ash on his face, Cal clenched his fists until his knuckles turned white. The moon was a graveyard of shadows. Its jagged surface stretched endlessly, barren and lifeless under the dim glow of a distant sun. Cal Valen trudged through the desolation, his body battered and his spirit broken. Every step felt heavier than the last, as if gravity itself conspired to keep him pinned to this forsaken rock. His breath came in ragged gasps, each exhale forming faint clouds that vanished almost instantly in the freezing air. He had no idea how long he'd been walking. Hours? Days? Time had lost all meaning since the ambush. All he knew was the ache in his bones and the fire in his heart. They took everything from him. Everything. And now, here he was, alone in the void, with nothing but memories of loss to keep him company. But fate, it seemed, wasn't done with Cal just yet. As he stumbled over a ridge of blackened stone, something caught his eye, a faint, pulsating light emanating from beneath the ground. At first, he thought it was a trick of his weary mind, but as he approached, the glow grew brighter, more insistent. It pulsed like a heartbeat, calling to him, drawing him closer despite his better judgment. Cale dropped to his knees and began digging with trembling hands. The frozen soil crumbled easily, revealing a strange object buried deep within the earth. It was small, no larger than his palm, but its surface shimmered with an otherworldly energy. Intricate patterns etched into the artifact shifted and writhed as though alive, responding to his presence. "What are you?" Cale whispered, his voice hoarse. A low hum filled the air, vibrating through his chest. Then, a voice, not spoken aloud, but resonating directly in his mind. "You have suffered greatly," it said, smooth and cold, like ice sliding across steel. "I can give you power, strength enough to crush your enemies and reshape the stars themselves." Cale froze, his grip tightening on the artifact. "Who are you?" "I am what remains of those who sought order and chaos. I am your salvation and your doom." The words sent a chill down his spine, but they also ignited a spark of hope in the darkness consuming him. Power. That's what he needed. Power to fight back. Power to make them pay. "And what do you want from me?" Cale asked cautiously. "Only balance," the voice replied. "Take my gift, and together we will burn away the corruption poisoning this universe." For a moment, doubt flickered in Cal's mind. This thing was alien, ancient, and clearly dangerous. But then he thought of his crew, slaughtered without mercy, his homeworld reduced to ashes. Chancellor Soren's smug face haunted his thoughts, fueling the rage simmering inside him. "I don't care about balance," Cale growled, clutching the artifact tightly. "I want vengeance." The artifact flared brightly, bathing him in searing light. Pain shot through his body as the object fused itself to his skin, burning like molten metal. He screamed, collapsing to the ground as waves of energy surged through him. Memories flooded his mind. Visions of destruction, worlds crumbling into dust, civilizations wiped clean. When the pain finally subsided, Cale stood shakily, feeling different, stronger, faster, more aware of every movement, every sound around him. He clenched his fist experimentally, watching as cracks formed in the rocky ground beneath his feet. The voice returned, quieter now. "The scales will tip, Cal Valen. Use this gift wisely, or watch as everything burns." Cale stared at his hands, flexing his fingers. For the first time since the betrayal, he felt alive. Dangerous. "Let it burn," he muttered, a grim smile tugging at his lips. Whatever this artifact was, whatever price it demanded, Cale didn't care. The universe would pay for what it had done to him. Starting with Chancellor Soren, Cale drifted through the lawless fringes of the galaxy, a ghost haunting the edges of civilization. His newfound powers made him dangerous, but they also made him reckless. He wandered from one crumbling outpost to another, leaving behind whispers of destruction wherever he went. Some called him a savior, others a monster. To Cale, it didn't matter. All that mattered was survival and revenge. It was on a dusty trading hub called Driftspire Station that his path crossed with the first of what would become his unlikely allies. The station was a chaotic maze of rusted metal and flickering neon lights, teeming with smugglers, mercenaries, and scavengers. Cale sat alone in a dimly lit cantina, nursing a drink he barely touched. His sharp eyes scanned the room, taking in every detail. The nervous twitch of a card dealer's hand, the quiet argument between two bounty hunters at the far table, the faint hum of machinery overhead. That's when he saw her. Zora moved like smoke, slipping between patrons with practiced ease. Her dark hair was tied back in a messy braid, and her worn jacket bore patches stitched together from scraps. She wasn't much older than 20, but there was a hardness in her gaze that spoke of years spent surviving by her wits, When she reached for a datapad left unattended on a nearby table, Kale intervened. "Stealing isn't going to fix whatever hole you're trying to fill," he said, his voice low but firm. Zora froze, then turned slowly, her hand hovering near a concealed blaster at her hip. "And who asked for your opinion?" She shot back, her tone laced with defiance. Kale smirked, leaning back in his seat. "Just saying. You're better than this." Her brow furrowed, caught off guard by his words. Before she could respond, the cantina erupted into chaos. Bounty hunters stormed in, weapons drawn, shouting for someone named Torkin. Panic spread like wildfire as patrons scrambled for cover. Kale didn't hesitate. He grabbed Zora's arm and pulled her behind an overturned table just as blaster fire filled the air. "What are you doing?" she hissed, struggling against his grip. "Saving your life," he replied calmly, peeking over the edge to assess the situation. Through the smoke and confusion, a massive figure emerged, a hulking alien with gray skin and glowing red eyes. Torkin. Despite his size, he moved with surprising speed, wielding a heavy repeater rifle with deadly precision. The bounty hunters didn't stand a chance. When the dust settled, Torkin approached their makeshift barricade, his weapon slung over his shoulder. "You two all right?" he rumbled, his deep voice carrying a surprising gentleness. Zora glared up at him. "We were fine until you showed up." Torkin chuckled, unfazed. "Guess I owe you thanks then. Name's Torkin. Ex-mercenary. Now just trying to stay alive." Kale stood, brushing dirt off his coat. "Cal Valen. And her." He nodded toward Zora. She crossed her arms, still glaring. "Zora. Hacker. Thief. Take your pick." For a moment, the three of them simply stared at each other, unsure whether to trust or walk away. But before anyone could speak, a fourth voice joined them. "You seem to be making quite the mess," said a calm, measured tone. They turned to see a slender woman in a pristine lab coat stepping cautiously into the cantina. Her sharp features and piercing blue eyes gave her an air of authority, though her disheveled appearance suggested she'd seen better days. "I'm Lyra," she introduced herself. "Ex-scientist. I couldn't help but notice you all might have something in common." "And what's that?" Kale asked, his expression guarded. Lyra hesitated, glancing around the ruined cantina. "Let's just say, we've all been betrayed by the same people. If you're looking for answers, or justice, you'll need allies, and I think I know where to start." Kale exchanged glances with Zora and Torkin. None of them trusted her completely, but desperation had a way of bringing strangers together. "All right," Kale said finally, his voice steady. "But if you're lying." Lyra smiled faintly. "I'm not. Trust me, we're stronger together." As they followed her into the shadows of Driftspire Station, Kale felt a flicker of hope for the first time in weeks. Maybe he wasn't alone after all. The journey to the nebula known as Vale's End was long and treacherous. Lyra had explained that it was a graveyard of ships, remnants of an ancient civilization swallowed by time and space. According to her fragmented research, these derelict vessels weren't just relics. They were fully functional warships, powered by technology far beyond anything the Accord possessed. If they could reactivate them, they'd have a fleet capable of challenging Chancellor Soren's forces. But Vale's End wasn't called a graveyard for nothing. As their small shuttle approached the swirling purple haze of the nebula, Kale felt a strange unease settle over him. The artifact fused to his hand pulsed faintly, as if reacting to something in the void ahead. He clenched his fist, trying to ignore the sensation. "This place gives me the creeps," Zara muttered from the co-pilot's seat, her fingers tapping nervously on the controls. "Feels like we're flying into a mouth waiting to snap shut." Torkin grunted from the back of the shuttle, checking his rifle for the 100th time. "If there's trouble, I'll shoot first and ask questions later." Lyra didn't respond, her eyes glued to the scanner readings. Her voice was steady but tinged with excitement. "We're close, just a little farther." Suddenly, The shuttle shuddered violently as a wave of electromagnetic energy rippled through the area. Lights flickered, and alarms blared. What was that? Zora shouted, gripping the controls tightly. Dark matter interference, Lyra replied, her tone clinical despite the chaos. It's destabilizing our systems. We need to land before. Another jolt sent the shuttle spiraling out of control. Kel grabbed onto the nearest handhold as the ship plummeted toward the surface of a massive derelict cruiser below. With a bone-rattling crash, they landed hard on the vessel's hull. When the dust settled, the four of them stepped out cautiously, their boots crunching against the cold metal surface. The cruiser loomed above them, its skeletal frame illuminated by the eerie glow of the nebula. Jagged spires and twisted corridors stretched endlessly, giving it the appearance of some great beast frozen in death. "This is it," Lyra whispered, her voice filled with awe. The Ghost Fleet. They entered through a gaping hole in the hull, finding themselves in a cavernous hangar bay. Dust-covered equipment lined the walls, and skeletal remains of alien creatures lay scattered across the floor. It was clear no one had set foot here in millennia. "All right, genius," Zale said, turning to Lyra. "How do we wake this thing up?" Lyra pulled out a portable terminal and began interfacing with a nearby console. After several tense minutes, the ship groaned to life. Lights flickered on, and dormant systems whirred back into operation. A deep hum resonated through the air, vibrating in their chests. "It's working," Lyra exclaimed, her face lighting up. But not everything was going smoothly. As more ships came online, strange side effects began to manifest. Torkin reported hearing whispers in languages he didn't understand. Zara claimed she saw shadows moving where none should be. Even Kale felt the artifact burning hotter, feeding off the dark matter powering the fleet. "We can't stay here too long," Kale warned, his jaw tight. "This place, it's alive, and it doesn't like us." Lyra nodded reluctantly. "I know, but we don't have a choice. If we want to fight back, we need this fleet." By the time they managed to reactivate 3 cruisers and a dozen smaller fighters, the toll was evident. Each of them looked haggard, their eyes bloodshot and movements sluggish. The dark matter was taking its toll, seeping into their minds and bodies. As they prepared to leave Vale's End, Kale stood at the helm of the lead cruiser, staring out at the fleet now under their command. For the first time, he allowed himself to believe they might actually stand a chance against Soren. But deep down, he couldn't shake the feeling that the fleet wasn't truly theirs. It belonged to something older, darker, and far more dangerous. The Ghost Fleet cut through the void like a blade slicing through silk, its dark hulls shimmering faintly under the light of distant stars. Kale stood on the bridge of the lead cruiser, Eclipse's Wrath, his hands gripping the railing as he stared at the tactical display before him. Their target was a key Accord supply line, a convoy carrying weapons, fuel, and resources destined for Chancellor Soren's war machine. If they succeeded, it would cripple the Accord's operations and send a message to the galaxy. The rebels were more than just whispers in the shadows. But Kale knew this wasn't just about strategy. It was personal. "Convoy spotted," Zara announced from her station, her fingers dancing across the holographic interface. 3 freighters, 2 escort frigates. Standard patrol route. Torkin leaned over her shoulder, his massive frame casting a shadow over the console. "Standard. That means easy pickings." He cracked his knuckles with a grin. "Let's hit 'em hard and fast." Lyra, seated nearby, adjusted her glasses nervously. "We should be careful. These ships are powered by unstable dark matter. Push them too far, and we risk losing control, or worse." Kale didn't respond immediately. His gaze remained fixed on the display, his mind racing. Lyra's warnings echoed in his thoughts, but so did the faces of his fallen crew, the ashes of his homeworld. This wasn't the time for caution. "We strike now," he said finally, his voice firm. "Zora, plot and intercept course. Torkin, prep the boarding teams. Lyra, monitor the fleet's systems. We can't afford any surprises. The others nodded, snapping into action. As the cruisers closed in on the convoy, Cale felt the familiar hum of the artifact beneath his skin. It pulsed in sync with the fleet's engines, feeding off the chaos brewing around them. For a moment, he wondered if the artifact was guiding him or controlling him, but there was no turning back now. When the Ghost fleet emerged from hyperspace, the Accord ships scrambled to respond. Alarms blared across their comms as the rebels opened fire. Bright beams of energy lanced through space, tearing into the frigate's shields. The convoy tried to scatter, but the Ghost fleet moved with precision, boxing them in. Boarding pods away. Torkin barked, watching as sleek black pods detached from the cruisers and latched onto the freighters. Within moments, rebel troops poured into the enemy vessels, overwhelming their crews. Cale watched the battle unfold with grim satisfaction. But then something went wrong. One of the frigates managed to break free, launching a counterattack that caught the rebels off guard. Explosions rocked the hangar bay of one of the cruisers, sending debris spiraling into space. Panic rippled through the fleet as systems began to fail. Dark matter instability detected. Lyra shouted, her voice trembling. "We're losing containment on multiple ships." Cale clenched his fists, the artifact flaring hot against his palm. He could feel its power surging, threatening to overwhelm him. Shadows flickered at the edges of his vision, whispering promises of destruction. "No," he growled, forcing himself to focus. "Zara, reroute all available power to the stabilizers. Torkin, get your team back aboard. Now." The crew worked frantically, stabilizing the fleet just as the final frigate exploded in a brilliant burst of light. Silence fell over the battlefield, broken only by the crackle of dying fires and the hum of damaged engines. As the rebels regrouped, Cale stepped onto the observation deck, staring out at the wreckage. Victory had come at a cost, dozens of lives lost, ships damaged beyond repair, and deep inside him, the artifact burned brighter than ever. Torkin joined him, his expression grim. "Good work, Captain. But you okay?" Cale didn't answer right away. His reflection in the viewport showed a man haunted by shadows, his eyes glowing faintly with unnatural light. "I'm fine," he lied, though neither of them believed it. For now, they had won. But Cale couldn't shake the feeling that the real battle was only beginning, and that the artifact's price had yet to be fully paid. The aftermath of the battle left the Ghost fleet limping through space, its ships battered and its crew exhausted. Cale retreated to his quarters aboard Eclipse's Wrath, seeking solitude amidst the chaos. But peace eluded him. The artifact fused to his hand throbbed with an unrelenting heat, its energy coursing through his veins like wildfire. Shadows danced in the corners of his vision, whispering secrets he couldn't or didn't want to understand. Lyra found him hours later, sitting alone in the dimly lit room. She hesitated at the doorway, her arms crossed tightly over her chest. "Cale," she said softly, "we need to talk." He glanced up, his expression unreadable. "About what?" "About this." She held up a datapad, its screen glowing faintly with lines of ancient text. "I've been analyzing the artifact. It's not just a power source. It's alive. And it's using you." Cale frowned but didn't respond. He had suspected as much, though hearing it aloud made the weight of it heavier. Lyra stepped closer, her voice trembling slightly. "It belongs to a race called the Oblivion. They believe the universe was corrupted by chaos, by life itself. Their goal was to purge existence, wiping away everything until only silence remained." Cale's jaw tightened. And now? Lyra hesitated, glancing at the artifact embedded in his flesh. "Now it's trying to finish what they started. Through you." For a moment, there was only silence. Cale stared at the floor, his mind racing. The artifact pulsed again, stronger this time, filling his thoughts with images of destruction, worlds crumbling into dust, stars extinguished one by one. He clenched his fist, fighting back the tide of despair threatening to drown him. "So that's it?" he asked finally, his voice low and bitter. "I'm just a puppet, a weapon for some dead race's final plan." "No," Lyra said firmly, stepping closer. "Not if you fight it. You're stronger than this thing, Kale. I've seen it. We all have." Kale shook his head, rising to his feet. "You don't get it. Every time I use its power, it takes more from me. It's changing me, Lyra, turning me into something unnatural. That's why we need to find a way to sever the connection," she insisted. "There has to be a way to remove it without losing you, or unleashing whatever's inside." Before Cal could respond, the ship shuddered violently, throwing them both off balance. Alarms blared throughout the vessel, red lights flashing in the corridors outside. "What's happening?" Cale demanded, already moving toward the door. "I don't know," Lyra shouted, following close behind. They reached the bridge to find Zora frantically working the controls while Torkin barked orders to the crew. The tactical display showed a massive energy surge emanating from one of the cruisers, a swirling vortex of dark matter tearing apart the ship from within. "It's destabilizing," Zora yelled. "If we don't contain it, the entire fleet goes down." Cal's heart sank as he realized the truth. The artifact wasn't just affecting him. It was spreading, corrupting the fleet itself. "We can't stop it," Lyra whispered, her face pale. "Not unless." "Unless what?" Cale snapped, turning to her. She met his gaze, her eyes filled with fear and resolve. "Unless you let go, Cale. You have to cut yourself off from it. Completely." Cale hesitated, the weight of her words sinking in. Letting go meant giving up the power that had kept him alive, that had given him hope of vengeance. But holding on meant dooming everyone and everything he cared about. As the cruiser began to break apart, Cale made his choice. "I'll do it," he said, his voice steady despite the storm raging inside him. "But I'll need your help." Together, they rushed to the engineering bay, where Lyra worked feverishly to isolate the artifact's energy signature. Meanwhile, Cale braced himself for what came next. The whispers grew louder, angrier, as if the Oblivion knew what he intended. When the process began, pain exploded through Cal's body. The artifact resisted, clawing at his mind, refusing to release its hold. But Cale fought back, channeling every ounce of willpower he had left. Finally, with a deafening roar, the artifact shattered, releasing a wave of energy that rippled through the fleet. The dark matter stabilized, and the vortex collapsed. When it was over, Cale collapsed to his knees, gasping for breath. The artifact was gone, but so was a part of him. As the crew cheered their narrow escape, Cale stared at his empty palm, knowing the fight was far from over. The victory over the Accord convoy had been costly, but it wasn't the losses or the damage to the fleet that weighed heaviest on Cal. It was the fractures forming within his own team. The rebellion they had built together was fragile, held together by shared pain and desperate hope. But trust, that was another matter entirely. It started with whispers. Zora noticed it first, a series of encrypted messages buried deep in the Ghost Fleet's communication logs. At first, she thought it was just routine chatter between ships, but something about the pattern seemed off. She dug deeper, her fingers flying across the console as lines of code scrolled past. When she finally decrypted the source, her blood ran cold. Lyra, the scientist who had risked everything to join them, who had helped uncover the truth about the artifact, was sending classified data directly to Chancellor Soren. Zara hesitated for a moment, torn between confronting Lyra outright and telling the others. In the end, she chose caution. She copied the evidence onto a secure datapad and stormed into the command center where Cale and Torkin were reviewing mission reports. "You need to see this," Zara said, her voice sharp with anger as she tossed the datapad onto the table. Cale picked it up, his brow furrowing as he scanned the contents. His jaw tightened, and his eyes flickered dangerously. "Lyra," he growled under his breath. Torkin leaned over, his massive frame casting a shadow over the display. What is this garbage? It's betrayal, Zara spat, crossing her arms. She's been feeding intel to Soren since day one. Before Cal could respond, the doors slid open and Lyra walked in. Her calm demeanor faltered when she saw their expressions. What's going on? She asked cautiously, glancing at the datapad in Cal's hand. You tell us, Cal said, stepping forward. His voice was low and icy. Care to explain why you've been selling us out? Lyra froze, her face pale. For a moment, silence hung heavy in the air. Then, slowly, she sank into a nearby chair, her hands trembling. I didn't have a choice, she admitted quietly. When I was exiled from the Accord, they gave me an ultimatum. Spy for them, or my family dies. Torkin snorted, gripping the back of a chair so hard his knuckles turned white. So you sold us out instead. How noble. It wasn't like that. Lyra snapped, tears welling in her eyes. I wanted to help you. I still do. But I couldn't let them hurt my sister. She's only 12. Cale stared at her, his expression unreadable. He knew what it meant to lose someone, to be backed into a corner with no way out. But this wasn't just about Lyra. It was about the rebellion, about survival. And now, he asked finally, are you done spying? Or does Soren know everything we're planning? Lyra shook her head vehemently. No, I swear, I haven't told him anything critical. I've been feeding him false information, buying us time. Please, Cal, you have to believe me. For a long moment, no one spoke. The weight of the decision rested squarely on Cal's shoulders. Trusting Lyra again would be risky, but losing her expertise might doom them all. All right, Cal said finally, his tone firm. You stay. But if you betray us again, I won't hesitate to end you myself. Lyra nodded, relief washing over her face. Thank you. But Zara wasn't convinced. As they left the room, she pulled Cal aside. You can't seriously trust her after this. I don't, Cal replied, his voice low. But we need her, for now. Just keep an eye on her. As tensions simmered beneath the surface, the crew prepared for their next move. Unbeknownst to them, Chancellor Soren was already mobilizing his forces, ready to strike back with everything he had. Betrayal had planted its seed, and it wouldn't take much for it to grow into something far more dangerous. The assault on Elysium Prime was supposed to be the rebellion's crowning moment, a bold strike at the heart of Chancellor Soren's empire. But as the Ghost Fleet descended upon the planet, Kel couldn't shake the feeling that they were walking into a trap. Elysium Prime gleamed like a jewel in the blackness of space, its golden spires piercing through layers of pristine clouds. It was the Accord's capital world, a monument to power and oppression. From orbit, it looked untouchable, but Kel knew better. Beneath its polished surface lay corruption, greed, and the blood of countless innocents. Approaching defensive perimeter, Zara announced from her station, her voice tense. Shields are up, but we can punch through if we hit them hard enough. Kel nodded, his gaze fixed on the tactical display. Torkin, prepare the fleet for maximum firepower. We don't stop until we reach Soren's fortress. Aye, Captain, Torkin replied, cracking his knuckles with grim determination. Lyra lingered near the back of the bridge, her hands clasped tightly together. She hadn't spoken much since her betrayal came to light, and though Kel had allowed her to stay, the mistrust between them hung heavy in the air. Are you sure about this? She asked softly, breaking the silence. If Soren knows we're coming. He knows, Kel interrupted, his tone sharp. But we're not here to play it safe. We're here to finish this. As the Ghost Fleet breached the orbital defenses, chaos erupted. Beams of energy crisscrossed the void, lighting up the darkness as rebel ships clashed with Accord warships. Explosions rippled across the battlefield, sending debris spiraling into the void. Despite their losses, the rebels fought with ferocity born of desperation. On the ground below, the battle raged just as fiercely. Rebel dropships descended through the atmosphere, deploying troops onto the sprawling cityscape of Elysium Prime. Streets became battlegrounds as civilians fled in terror, caught in the crossfire of a war they never asked for. Kale led the charge toward Soren's fortress, cutting through waves of Accord soldiers with brutal efficiency. His blade glinted in the dim light, each swing fueled by years of pain and rage. Behind him, Torkin roared like a storm, his massive frame carving a path through enemy lines. When they finally reached the fortress gates, Kale paused, staring up at the towering structure. This was it, the endgame. Inside, Chancellor Soren awaited them. The chamber was vast, lined with holographic displays showing the ongoing battle. Soren stood at the center, his immaculate suit untouched by the chaos around him. He turned slowly, a smug smile playing on his lips as Cal stepped forward. "Captain Valen," Soren said smoothly, spreading his arms in mock welcome. "I always knew you'd come crawling back." Cal's hand tightened around his weapon. "This ends now, Soren." Soren chuckled, shaking his head. "You think you're fighting for justice. You're nothing but a broken man clutching at revenge. And revenge, well, it consumes everything it touches." The words struck a nerve, but Kale refused to let them sway him. He lunged, their duel erupting in a blur of steel and fury. Soren wasn't just a politician. He was trained, skilled, and ruthless. Each strike pushed Cal closer to the edge, forcing him to confront the darkness within himself. "You've already lost, Kale," Soren taunted, dodging a blow. "Your rebellion is built on lies and betrayal. How long do you think they'll follow you once they see what you truly are?" For a moment, doubt flickered in Cal's mind. Images of his crew, his homeworld, the artifact, all of it swirled together, threatening to overwhelm him. But then he remembered why he was here. Not for revenge, but for redemption, for everyone who deserved better than the hand they'd been dealt. With a final, desperate surge, Kale disarmed Soren, pinning him to the ground. The Chancellor's smug grin faltered, replaced by fear. "It's over," Kale growled, raising his blade. But before he could strike, alarms blared throughout the fortress. Lyra's voice crackled over the comms. "Kale, the dark matter reactors, they're destabilizing. If we don't evacuate, the entire planet will." Kale hesitated, torn between vengeance and survival. In that moment, Soren seized his chance, grabbing a concealed weapon and firing. Pain exploded in Cal's side as he stumbled back, blood staining his armor. "Run while you still can, Captain," Soren sneered, retreating deeper into the fortress. Clutching his wound, Kale made his choice. Revenge would have to wait. "Fall back," he ordered, limping toward the exit. The retreat from Elysium Prime was a blur of fire and chaos. The once gleaming spires of the Accord's capital crumbled under the weight of their own destruction, consumed by the very dark matter reactors that had powered its opulence. Cal staggered through the crumbling fortress, his side burning with every step, blood seeping through his fingers as he clutched the wound. Behind him, explosions tore through the halls, sending chunks of debris raining down like judgment from above. "Move faster," Torkin barked, half-dragging Lyra, as they sprinted toward the extraction point. Her face was pale, streaked with soot and tears, but she forced herself to keep moving. Zara brought up the rear, firing blindly into the collapsing corridors to hold off pursuing Accord soldiers. Kale knew they couldn't outrun the collapse forever. The reactor core was destabilizing rapidly, its energy spreading outward in waves of destruction. If they didn't make it out soon, none of them would survive. But survival wasn't the only thing on Cal's mind. As they reached the hangar bay, where their last remaining dropship waited, Kale stopped abruptly. His sharp eyes scanned the group. Torkin's hulking frame, Lyra's trembling hands, Zora's defiant glare, and something inside him shifted. "This is far enough," he said, his voice low but firm. "What are you talking about?" Zara snapped, turning to face him. "We don't have time for speeches." "I'm not giving one," Kale replied, meeting her gaze. "You three need to go. Now." "No way," Torkin growled, stepping forward. "You think we're leaving you behind? Forget it. It's not your choice," Kale shot back, his tone hardening. "If I stay, I can buy you enough time to get clear. If I go, we all die." Lyra stepped forward, her voice shaking. "Kale, please, don't do this." He softened slightly, looking at her with an expression that mixed pain and resolve. "You've already done more than anyone could ask, Lyra. You gave us a chance. Now take it." Before any of them could argue further, alarms screamed louder, and the ground beneath them shook violently. A massive chunk of the ceiling collapsed nearby, forcing them to scatter. Zara grabbed Cal's arm, her grip surprisingly strong despite her small frame. "We're stronger together. That's what you told us. And now I'm telling you to live," Cal said, prying her hand off. "Take the rebellion somewhere safe. Finish what we started." With that, he turned and ran back into the heart of the fortress, ignoring their shouts. The artifact's faint hum returned, resonating with the unstable energy around him. He could feel it calling to him, urging him to embrace its power one last time. When he reached the reactor core, the scene was apocalyptic. Energy surged wildly, crackling across the walls like lightning. The air shimmered with heat, distorting everything it touched. Kale approached the console, his hands trembling as he accessed the controls. "There has to be a way to contain this," he muttered, his fingers flying over the interface. But deep down, he knew there wasn't. The only option left was sacrifice. He activated the emergency containment protocols, channeling the reactor's energy directly into himself. Pain erupted through his body, white-hot and unbearable, as the artifact flared brighter than ever before. It pulsed in sync with the reactor, absorbing the energy until Cal felt like he might shatter into pieces. Through the agony, he heard the others shouting his name over the comms. "Kale, get out of there," Zara screamed. But he didn't answer. Instead, he whispered a single word: "Goodbye." With a final surge of willpower, Cal triggered the failsafe, sealing the reactor's energy within himself. The core stabilized just long enough for the dropship to escape, carrying his friends to safety. As the fortress collapsed around him, Cal fell to his knees, the artifact glowing brighter still. For the first time in years, he felt peace, not revenge, not anger, but acceptance. And then, silence. When the rebels emerged from hyperspace, they stared back at Elysium Prime as it vanished in a blinding flash. Tears streamed down their faces, but amidst the grief, there was hope. Cal had given them a future, and they wouldn't waste it. The universe mourned Cal Valen, though few outside the rebellion knew his name. To the galaxy at large, he was just another casualty of war, a faceless rebel swallowed by the flames of Elysium Prime. But to those who had fought beside him, he was something more. He was a leader, a protector, and in the end, a savior. Weeks passed, and the scars of battle lingered, not just on the rebel ships, but in their hearts. Zara spent hours staring out at the stars from the bridge of Eclipse's wrath, her fingers absently tracing patterns on the console. Torkin threw himself into repairs, his massive hands working tirelessly to keep the Ghost Fleet operational, though his usual bravado had dimmed. Lyra buried herself in research, analyzing fragments of data salvaged from the artifact, searching for answers that might explain what had happened to Cal. But no matter how hard they tried, none of them could forget the man who had given everything to save them. "He should be here," Zara muttered one evening, breaking the silence that had settled over the bridge. "We wouldn't even have made it this far without him." Torkin grunted, leaning against the wall with his arms crossed. "Yeah, well, he's not. And sitting around crying about it won't change a damn thing." "It's not crying," Zara shot back, her voice sharp. "It's remembering. Something you clearly don't care about." Before Torkin could respond, Lyra stepped between them, her expression calm but firm. "Enough. Fighting won't bring him back. What matters now is finishing what he started." Her words hung in the air, heavy with meaning. They all knew what she meant. The rebellion wasn't over. Chancellor Soren still clung to power, his grip weakened but not broken. The Accord's corruption ran deep, and rooting it out would take time, effort, and sacrifice. Kale had shown them the way forward. Now it was up to them to follow it. In the weeks that followed, the rebels regrouped, rallying survivors from across the galaxy to their cause. Word spread of their victory at Elysium Prime, inspiring hope among those who had long since given up. Planets once loyal to the Accord began to rise up, their people demanding justice and freedom. Under Lyra's guidance, the rebellion established a fragile coalition, a patchwork alliance of outcasts, exiles, and dreamers united by a shared vision of a better future. It wasn't perfect, and tensions often flared, but it was a start. Meanwhile, Kel's legacy lived on, not as a symbol of vengeance, but of redemption. Stories of his sacrifice spread like wildfire, painting him as a hero who had chosen to save others rather than seek revenge. Even those who had doubted him came to respect his courage and selflessness. As for Kel himself, far beyond the reach of stars, in the cold emptiness of space, something stirred. The artifact, thought destroyed along with Elysium Prime, pulsed faintly with residual energy. Its whispers echoed through the void, searching, waiting. And somewhere, deep within its fractured core, a spark remained, a fragment of Kel's consciousness clinging to existence. He didn't know where he was or how much time had passed. All he knew was the burning need to fight, to protect, to make things right. The artifact's influence still lingered, whispering promises of destruction, but Kale resisted. "I'm done being your weapon," he murmured into the darkness, his voice barely audible. For now, he drifted alone, a ghost adrift in the endless night. But the universe wasn't finished with him yet. Somewhere, worlds still burned. Somewhere, people still suffered. And somewhere, the oblivion watched, patient and eternal. When the time came, Kale would rise again. Not as a destroyer, but as a beacon, a reminder that even in the darkest moments, there was always a chance for light.